I would like to ask you that what do you think is the detail that a writer who's perhaps writing a book on a crime story, what is the detail that he brings to covering a story which perhaps a writer who is in a hurry to report it doesn't?
So I have the good fortune of having been on both sides of this divide, if you will, as you put it, for the same story. So I was reporting on a daily basis for the Mumbai Mirror, and that has a deadline. So there are certain things which perhaps get compromised when you um, have a deadline. You're getting back from a court, which is 2.5 hours away from where you stay, and you need to write stuff quickly. However, the guiding principles of basic journalism don't change. As in, are the facts that you're reporting checked and verified? Are your sources attributed? Have you named your sources? Are they all kosher? And do you have a single strain running through your story for that day, so that it can be headlined in a decent manner, which makes it easy to access for the reader. So those three things are there. But what it doesn't do is that in the process of writing that piece for that day, a number of questions may arise in your head, which it is not possible to answer within the same time frame. So really, my book came about in some ways from those questions that I asked myself at the end of every day. Why? What was the motivation for somebody to have said something in court? Is the piece of evidence that was being discussed today exactly as it was? Was it tampered with? Was it not? Now, these questions, they remained with me over the period of coverage of the trial. And in the process of writing the book, I could go back to all of these questions and try and answer them with additional reporting. So, the short answer is if you're writing a book, you're contributing more, not just with volume, but also with better quality of reportage. You have the opportunity to do that. So, one should take that opportunity and do the best they can. That's really the answer.
And do you think literature inspired by a true incident, even if it takes some creative liberty, can affect the course the real life incident is taking?
It can, but not in a systemic way, or not in the way that the system allows it, or in fact, the system does not account for this at all. For instance, I mean, if I were to speak about this case, you see, the judiciary is above influence of any sort. That's the position it's arrogated to itself in our society. This is a fine thing, there's no problem with that. However, to make the case that people in the judicial system are not also, like the rest of us, products of their environment would be a mistaken, assumption. I don't think that applies. Um, Having said that, I think it's important. It's not just influence that we are talking about over here. It's also sensitivity. That's one of the things that your environment does to you. It influences you, perhaps in some good ways, perhaps in some bad ways, but a positive way of looking at that influence, if you will, is that you are sensitized to what is fair and what is good, and perhaps what is not as well.
So, for instance, while writing Arushi, were you expecting that the book, after the book is published, it might have some influence, some effect on the course that the case was taking?
Well, there are examples of this abroad, not quite here. I could quote a very recent case, that of this podcast called Serial, which has led to the reopening of a 15-year-old, 20-year-old murder case in the States. Now, this can happen, and I believe should happen, if there is new evidence that is brought to the fore. I believe in Arushi there is new evidence. In my book, there is new evidence. Now it's really up to the courts to take a view on how new that is and how relevant that is, and go with their judgment on that.
Also, what we have seen in Arushi's case, or perhaps say in Rani Mukherjee's case, Being a journalist yourself, do you think Indian media needs to be a little more careful, sensitive, and perhaps follow some self regulation while covering crime stories?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there is any. It's not about just crime stories. I'd say any stories, and I have always said that I'm a free speech advocate. So you're right. I mean, the word self-regulation therefore strikes a chord with me. For me, it's not even regulation, to be honest with you. A lot of things that we do as journalists should come to us intuitively. I keep saying this, but the tools of our trade or the devices that we have at our disposal or the rules that we follow are neither new nor do they need to be taught in some ways. For instance, if I tell you, be fair while reporting something, I could tell you about that about any aspect of your life. Be fair in your transactions. Be fair. With journalism comes some small additional burdens, as in like what you put out, you need to put out reasonably and responsibly. This entails verification or checking, which you're supposed to do in any case, and attribution. Name your source. Um, that's the classic way to do journalism. Is that none of those things have changed. In that the rules haven't changed as such. It's the culture of work, which has, I guess, eroded some of those
Yeah, like what
things.
about things like, the term which has perhaps come up for it is media trial. I mean, even when the case is sub judice, the kind of reportage which follows, or the kind of terminologies which are used, the kind of words which are used, kind of give us sort of an inclination to the case in some direction, which perhaps is
Right.
not the ideal thing to do.
So it isn't just the media that's responsible for this. The media, of course, is what you could call the last port of call for this story. But how this takes place is that the agencies or the criminal justice system is such, the police or investigating agencies, they have a narrative in their head which they eventually want to carry through to a court of law if they want to finish it at all. And they'd much rather that public sentiment or public opinion more or less favors that line of thinking. Therefore, there are leaks to the press, which are often and far too often carried by the press as if they were gospel. In the specific case of the Talwars, uh, none of this has ever been shown to have a shred of truth. For instance, the stories about their having orgies in hotels, or the stories about wife swapping, or any of that. None of it was ever backed up by even a shred of evidence. And the journalistic work done to put those stories out was, I'd say, not journalistic at all. They were more stenography than journalism. Just taking, one person's, not even a view, one person's invented narrative and writing it as if it's your own. That's not journalism, according to me. And I really feel that there should be some way in which there should be avenues of redressal for sufferers of this kind of thing. Unfortunately, that system is not really, while the laws are in place, but the execution of the laws or how they get applied and how much time it takes, that's a big disincentive for anyone at the receiving end of this sort of journalism and that kind of leak that the Talwars had to go through. Yeah.
That's right. And if you talk about investigative journalism, what kind of space do you think that investigative journalism enjoys in India? Do you think our reporters, our journalists have enough financial support from the publications or the organizations? They have enough freedom of expression to carry out an investigation?
See, yes and no. I mean, actually, the question is, I'm not a cynic in this regard. In that, I feel that there are enough very good journalists still around. We might whine a little bit about the culture of, say, news television journalism or even mainstream newspaper journalism, and how little depth seems to matter in all of this. But having said that, we as consumers of the very same media should also, in some form or the other, voice our protest. And one of the ways in which this is coming about is not through some flag waving or marching or speech making. It's actually coming about through platforms, in fact, such as yours, which are truly independent. And where if you put in the work, it is not impossible for you to publish. In the old days, in the classic scenario, what you had was the big media house, which really is your gatekeeper till the time that you get published. That barrier has been broken by social media. It has its downsides because a lot of people can put out rubbish as well. But if you get into it with a reasonable mind and with public interest at the top of your thoughts, then it's entirely possible and it's being done at the moment. So I don't see, uh, I see an erosion, of course, but I also see hope in some ways.
That's great. And any message that you'd like to give to people who are aspiring investigative journalists?
Verify, attribute.
Great. Thanks a lot, sir. Thank you so much.